I have a confession to make. See, because Dune was your most anticipated movie for 2021, I was going to make a video essay about it. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I didn't really have anything to say that hasn't already been said. I mean, I was always going to like this movie. An adaptation of one of my favorite sci-fi books, made by a cohort of people in front of and behind the camera who are pretty much the best people working in their fields today. Of course it was great. So rather than talk about Dune specifically, I want to instead talk about a quiet revolution that has taken place in the last decade or so, which is the rejection of 3D movies and the celebration of the cinematic experience offered by IMAX. That's right, instead of a video essay about a beautiful movie by one of the most critically acclaimed directors working today, instead you're going to get a video about statistics. I mean, they are movie statistics, and I'm using them to make what is ultimately a creative point about filmmaking, but yeah, there's going to be some maths. Also, I say IMAX 53 times in this video. Anyway, let's start by going back in time. The year is 2009, and Avatar is the biggest movie ever. People like Roger Ebert and Steven Spielberg are calling it the next Star Wars. In just 19 days, it has made more than $1 billion. About a month later, it had doubled that. Avatar was a must-see movie event, and much of the credit for that was given to its pioneering use of 3D. Avatar was going to be the movie that brought this filmmaking technology into the mainstream. And even though Avatar quickly dropped out of the pop culture conversation, 3D stuck around, and by 2016, over 22% of the global box office was coming from 3D sales. Even today, most major blockbusters still offer a 3D release. But like the Avatar movie itself, the novelty quickly wore off. By 2019, 3D sales had dropped to just 16% of the global total, even though it was a record box office year. 2020 is an anomaly because of the pandemic, but 3D sales made up just under 6% of the global market that year. Now, the 3D decline happened for several reasons, but before we look into those, we need to talk about IMAX. And I should acknowledge here that IMAX films are sometimes shown in 3D. We'll come back to that. Anyway, in 2009, IMAX's worldwide box office share was 0.9%. By 2019, it was 3.5%. Now that might not sound like much, but that represents an increase from about $270 million to $1.4 billion. And remember that there are far, far fewer IMAX screens than there are 3D ones. Worldwide, there are about 1,500 IMAX screens, and compare that to the 122,000 3D ones. So using some Pentex maths here, that means in 2019, your average 3D screen bought in about $55,000, while the average IMAX screen bought in close to $1 million. So how did we get here? Why is IMAX breaking records year on year and seeing incredible growth while 3D is being kept on life support? Well, besides the fact that they give some people headaches and eye strain, probably the main reason is the fact that most movies released in 3D are not actually 3D movies. They are regular 2D movies that have been digitally converted into 3D. See, 3D cameras work by using stereo photography, which means placing two cameras side by side to record separate images representing the left and right eye. So movies made using these cameras look better than the ones converted from 2D because it will capture an actual 3D image rather than having to replicate one artificially. Like in this interview, Michael Bay is talking about how images like this are just too complicated to post-convert because it's impossible to individually map the millions of tiny particles in the explosion. But the real reason movies made with stereoscopic cameras are better than 2D converts is because if a production is using these cameras, then they always intended for the film to be made in 3D, and the filmmakers will have designed the production accordingly. Avatar was made as a 3D film from the beginning. See how almost every shot has something in the foreground? Every frame is designed to take advantage of the depth offered by 3D. But after its success, other big budget blockbusters were quickly converted to 3D to take advantage of the higher ticket prices. But because they weren't supposed to be 3D movies, audiences were not getting an experience that was worth the higher price. Now, some major productions were being made specifically for the 3D format in the years after Avatar, but they were drowned out because almost every single movie advertised itself as 3D. This is called brand dilution. In just a couple of years, 3D had gone from being a unique, one-of-a-kind cinematic experience to, well, just a more expensive ticket for what was usually a very average movie, to which 3D added very little. But for me, none of this comes close to the biggest reason 3D does not add to the cinematic experience, and I'll let Christopher Nolan explain what that is. I think it's a misnomer to call it 3D versus 2D. The whole point of cinematic imagery is that it's three-dimensional. 95% of our depth cues come from occlusion, resolution, color, and so forth, so the idea of calling a 2D movie a 2D movie is a little misleading. Basically, 3D doesn't add much because we already know how to process 2D images images as 3D. After all, humans have been doing this for hundreds of years. So let's say you're a filmmaker like Christopher Nolan and you want your movie to stand out and be a true cinematic experience. If 3D is just going to be a distracting gimmick, how do you make an impact? Well, you give people an experience. An IMAX experience. A standard feature film is shot on a 35mm print. Some older epics go further and use a 70mm print to create an ultra widescreen effect. Well, IMAX is also a 70mm print, but a 70mm frame has 5 perforations on the side. What IMAX does is turn that film sideways, and each frame has not 5, not 10, but 15 perforations. What does this mean? Well, it means the image is up to 9 times bigger than a 35mm print and has more than 10 times the number of pixels. You thought 4K was good. Try 12K. What this means is that unlike 3D, IMAX can't be faked. Okay, well it sort of can, but the original image still needs to be filmed in a very high resolution in order to do so, and even then, it still won't match the full aspect ratio and resolution of a 70mm IMAX print. Let me show you what I mean. This is a standard cinema screen. This is a digital IMAX screen for showing movies that have been scaled up to an IMAX resolution. It's pretty good, but the reason it is sometimes called LIMAX is because this is the size of an average IMAX screen that is capable of showing the full 70mm film. But it doesn't stop there, because this is the largest IMAX screen in the world. Forget things flying at you out of a screen. If you want a truly immersive cinema experience, then try watching a plane hijacking with a life-size plane. Now, I said earlier that IMAX cinemas also show movies in 3D, so isn't it a bit misleading to say IMAX is better than 3D? Well, funnily enough, IMAX is actually the best way to see a 3D movie because the cinemas by definition have to be of a higher quality, and the screen is large enough that the 3D illusion isn't broken by the edge of the frame. But I argue that even in these settings, the 3D is still adding very little from a creative point of view compared to IMAX. Movies released in IMAX 3D are IMAX movies first, and 3D is a distant second, and the filmmaking is designed to take advantage of the former, not the latter. See, because IMAX cameras are big, heavy, and expensive, only the biggest movie productions can afford to use them. So when you see an IMAX movie, you know that it will have sequences and cinematography that were explicitly designed to take advantage of the format. Which brings us back to Christopher Nolan. Nolan almost single-handedly brought IMAX into the mainstream, starting with the 28 minutes of The Dark Knight that was shot on IMAX, including the iconic opening scene. This whole sequence was played before IMAX screenings of I Am Legend instead of a trailer, and I think it was the first time most people properly understood what IMAX was capable of, because The Dark Knight opened in 94 IMAX venues in its opening weekend, and every single one of them was sold out. So after Christopher Nolan and James Cameron, other directors soon followed. First off the rank was of course Michael Bay with Transformers Revenge of the Fallen, while Terrence Malick shot The Tree of Life in IMAX, but never actually screened it in IMAX theaters. Ghost Protocol started the trend of Mission Impossible movies having some absolutely spectacular action sequences that were designed for the scale of IMAX. J.J. Abrams used IMAX for some scenes in Star Trek and The Force Awakens, knowing full well that scenes like this would be absolutely epic on an IMAX screen. No Time to Die was the first James Bond film to use 70mm IMAX cameras. Marvel quickly caught up, and Endgame became the first Hollywood movie entirely shot on IMAX certified cameras. This is when I point out that there is a big difference between IMAX film cameras of the kind Christopher Nolan uses and filmed for IMAX digital cameras that Marvel use. But this video is long enough as it is without me getting into that, so links in the description if you're interested. Anyway, even though other directors have been using IMAX more and more, Nolan remains the pioneer. 2/3 of Dunkirk was presented in the format. Interstellar broke IMAX opening weekend records, while 14% of Tenet's opening weekend total came from IMAX, despite them being just 1% of the screens showing it. People know that a Christopher Nolan film is special, and it needs to be experienced in IMAX. And besides him, one of the only other directors working today whose films deserve the IMAX experience is Denis Villeneuve. Which brings us, at last, to Dune. Dune is the epitome of the IMAX experience. Dune is a story on a galactic scale, a story with enormous spaceships and epic vistas of a vast desert planet. And while they used digital IMAX cameras, not the full 70mm film ones, the production was still designed from the very beginning to offer a cinematic experience that would be defined by the epic scope and scale of the story being told. Contrast it with, say, another major and beloved sci-fi property that has instead just been adapted into a TV series for you to watch at home on your laptop, laptop or, God forbid, your phone. The fact that I could be talking about either The Expanse or Foundation kind of proves this point, because unlike Dune, these shows are not events. They're just another streaming show, which, like 3D movies, is something suffering from brand dilution. Look, if you want to see a movie at home, I get it. You don't have to go out, you don't have to deal with crowds or kids or people on their phone or adverts or any of the other bullshit that happens when you go to a theatre. Plus, movie tickets are expensive. Plenty of movies come out that are perfectly suited for streaming at home. But 2 or 3 times a year, you'll get a movie like Dune. And when those movies come along, you owe it to yourself to see it in the cinema. Because you're not just buying a movie ticket, you're buying an experience. And that makes going to the movies something special. It makes it an event. Now look, I know a lot of you will have experienced cinematic movies like Star Wars for the first time at home, not in cinemas, and you still love them. But that's not my point. A great film transcends format and is great regardless of how you watch it. That's why movies like Jurassic Park and The Matrix survived the move to home videos, whereas Avatar was forgotten because the special effects breakthroughs weren't enough to compensate for the story. But if you're watching a great film, then IMAX just elevates the experience. IMAX promises you that the movie was made by some of the best filmmakers working in the world today, who used all of their considerable talent to make the movie the best possible cinematic experience it can be. So you need to watch it for the first time in the best possible cinema, with the best possible sound and the best possible image. Because if there's only going to be a couple of event movies every year, then you need to make seeing them an event. I guarantee that you still remember how it felt to watch this for the first time in the cinema. Plus, when you see a movie in IMAX, you know that everyone else in the theatre is there to share that experience. So you generally don't get the kids and the talking and the phones ringing and so on, because everyone else in that theatre is a fellow cinema lover who is willing to pay more to experience the film properly. They're people who understand that movies like Dune, or Endgame, or a new James Bond or Christopher Nolan movie, they aren't just movies. They're cinematic history being written, and you need to experience that in the best possible way. You need to experience it in IMAX.